This is Dr. James Strickler, and this is a course in United States history. This lecture deals with Chapter 30, the recent past, in the United States history textbook, American Yawp. The defining event of the recent past was the September 11th attack in 2001. This terrorist attack changed American history, and so we're going to approach the modern era by first discussing things that occurred before September 11th and then things that occurred after. In 1988, George H.W. Bush, the first George Bush to be president of the United States, ran to succeed Ronald Reagan as president. George H.W. Bush had been Ronald Reagan's vice president, and his election would be seen as a continuance of the Reagan era. His opponent was a man named Michael Dukakis, the Democratic governor of the state of Massachusetts. The election, to a great extent, was decided on the accusations made by George H.W. Bush that Michael Dukakis was an extremist liberal and something of a wimp. Now, this was an effective campaign strategy because the 1980s were a time of muscular masculinity, of the country, the people of the United States wanting to be big and tough and seen that way in the world. It was also a time of a backlash against the liberal excesses of the 1960s and the 1970s. What this meant was that Michael Dukakis, who was seen as a liberal from the 1960s and 70s, and who came across as not a tough guy, was at an extreme disadvantage in the election, which led to a fairly easy victory for George H.W. Bush. This was also a continuance of the popularity of Ronald Reagan, with George H.W. Bush having been his vice president. But primarily it was an election about the general attitude of the country, which Michael Dukakis, who was sort of a standard issue liberal at the time, no longer fit. One event during the campaign that illustrated how he no longer fit with the attitude of America was an infamous ad produced by the Bush campaign dealing with a prisoner named Willie Horton. Willie Horton was imprisoned in Massachusetts for murder, but as part of a weekend furlough program instituted in Massachusetts, he was allowed to go home on weekends to be with his family, despite serving a murder conviction. While home on one of these leaves, he actually committed a rape and a murder. Well, this was seen as an example by George Bush and by his supporters of the weak ineptness, of the over-sentimental weakness of liberals, and of Michael Dukakis in particular. They just weren't tough on crime, and they needed to be pointed out for being weak on crime. But critics of this ad saw it as a not so thinly veiled play of the racist tropes of the past. Willie Horton was a scary-looking black man, and this was, they thought, intentionally picked as the subject of this commercial to scare white voters away from Michael Dukakis and into the arms of George Bush. Well, what we know for sure is that there was a general feeling in the country at the time, a fear of crime that people thought had gotten out of control in the 1970s, and a desire to bring it under rein. And this played into those ideas also. When George Bush assumed the office of president, it wasn't very long after that the Soviet Union collapsed. While we can credit Ronald Reagan more so with the victory of the Cold War than George W. Bush, it just so happened that the actual end of it didn't come until Ronald Reagan left office and George Bush replaced him. This left George Bush's America as the sole superpower in the world. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, no country on earth could match America for its might and for its influence. This was such a dramatic change that one political scientist, a man named Francis Fukuyama, wrote a book titled The End of History, in which he theorized that we had come to the end of our ideological journey as people of planet Earth, that democratic capitalism had reigned victorious, and it would spread all over the world and become the form of government from then on for humans. Now, while he may eventually turn out to be right, he wasn't right in the near term. There are still struggles over what kind of governments nations should have, including authoritarian governments like that in China appearing to be successful, dictatorships still existing, Islamic republics, things like that. So while we may eventually get to a place where democracy and capitalism rule over the whole earth, we were not there just because the Cold War had come to an end. But there were signs that capitalism and democracy were making progress around the world, even in places that had long resisted them. An example was in China in 1979. After the death of Chairman Mao, who had led the Chinese people in their communist revolution, a new man took over as the leader of the Communist Party, a man named Deng Xiaoping. And he realized that China's economy was sort of doomed for failure, that the sticking to the strict ideals of communism were leading to economic stagnation and eventually an inability to continue to have his people progress. So Deng Xiaoping instituted a series of economic reforms in China, which he described as socialism, in other words, communism, with Chinese characteristics. Now, this is a flat-out lie about what he was doing. He was actually instituting market reforms, allowing people to engage in capitalism. And this ended up having a dramatic effect on the Chinese economy. It grew dramatically thereafter and lifted the people of China out of the poverty that they had been in under strict communism. Still, the Communist Party would remain with an iron hold over China, as it still does to this day. You're allowed a lot of economic freedom in China, so long as you don't offend the Communist Party. If you do, they can very quickly put you out of business. On the other hand, if you please the Communist Party, they can very quickly make things easy for your business. So while there is a lot of free enterprise going on in China, there is still a lot of government control. I guess maybe that's what he meant by socialism with Chinese characteristics. Maybe it would be better to describe it as capitalism with authoritarian Chinese characteristics. But nonetheless, it shows how the success of capitalism could not even be ignored by a committed communist country like China. The first big foreign policy threat, though, that came along to the United States after the collapse of the communist countries of Europe that ended the Cold War came because of the Iraqi invasion of the country of Kuwait. Iraq is a country in the Middle East that had been at war with its neighboring country of Iran for many years. This had left them feeling both inadequate militarily because they were unable to defeat Iran, and also economically harmed by the effects of the war. The leader of Iraq, a man named Saddam Hussein, decided that a way to deal with those problems would be to invade the small country of Kuwait that neighbored Iraq. Not only would this give Iraq a victory, which would help with the morale of the country, but it would also give Iraq access to the Kuwaiti oil fields. Kuwait, though being a small country, was very rich in oil, which made it relatively wealthy. So Iraq invaded Kuwait. This had a disturbing effect for other countries around the world, because Kuwait was seen as an easy partner with Western capitalist democracies for getting access to oil. Iraq was not seen as nearly so friendly a nation. So what happened was a coalition of countries from around the world joined with the United States to stage an invasion to free Kuwait from Iraq. That invasion came in two stages. The first was called Operation Desert Shield, where the United States set up forward bases in the Middle East where they could prepare the military for the assault that would drive Iraq from the country of Kuwait. This Operation Desert Shield included the placement of a United States military base in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This was by invitation of the Saudi government, and the Saudi government in fact paid the United States a lot of money for them to remove Saddam Hussein's Iraqi armies from Kuwait. This was done because Saudi Arabia saw Saddam Hussein as eventually a threat to them, and they wanted him beaten back, and they were willing to pay the United States to do it. This actually resulted in the United States turning a profit off of the Gulf War, as it eventually was known. The second component of this removal of Iraq from Kuwait, the second component of what we call the Gulf War, was Operation Desert Storm. This is when the troops that had been mastering Operation Desert Shield actually attacked the Iraqi forces in Kuwait and drove them from the country. The photograph you see here is of the devastation that was left behind when the Iraqis retreated. They set the Kuwaiti oil fields on fire. Fortunately, the technology existed that these fires were put out fairly quickly, thus restoring the Kuwaiti oil economy and preventing even more massive environmental damage from the smoke that was released. The United States invasion of Kuwait to drive out the Iraqis, along with their coalition of allies, was broadcast around the world by news programs. Of particular note was the effort of the cable news network, which had been started in 1980, to cover the Gulf War in 1991. They had reporters who were reporting live from the region, both accompanying the coalition forces as they moved in to drive Iraq from Kuwait, and from the country of Kuwait itself. This gave Americans a real-time viewing of the war as it happened, on both sides of the lines of the war. People ended up glued to their televisions for hours a day, watching the latest news from the battlefront. This was a step beyond the living room war that the Vietnam War was known for, because this was happening in real time, 24 hours a day. You didn't have to wait to see on the evening news what was happening in the war. You could turn on CNN at any time to see what was happening. This ended up being a big boost for CNN, a big boost for the changes in cable and satellite television that were expanding across the country, that created niche markets such as the 24-hour news channel. It was a way in which Americans could experience the war as it happened, and it in some ways changed our views of war. After the successful driving of Iraq from Kuwait, George H.W. Bush's popularity was sky high. By some polls, nearly 80% of people in the country approved of how he was functioning as President of the United States. When he ran for re-election in 1988, though, he had a problem. Not only were people in some ways getting tired of the Reagan Revolution holding the presidency now for 12 years straight, but when he had campaigned for the Republican nomination in 1988, he had famously said that he would never raise taxes as president. In fact, saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes." This was used against him when he ran for election again in 1992. A challenger rose up in the Republican Party, a man named Pat Buchanan, who made a big deal about Bush breaking his promise about taxes. While Buchanan was not able to defeat Bush to get the nomination, and Bush was renominated to be president again, his candidacy had been damaged by Pat Buchanan's criticisms. Now, this was internal damage from within the Republican Party, one Republican criticizing another. This is why presidents who are running for re-election always want to avoid challenges from within their own parties. If they're going to be wounded and damaged in an election, they don't want that to happen from friendly fire. But it did in this case, which weakened Bush's case for being re-elected in 1992. But nonetheless, even though he was weakened by the candidacy of Pat Buchanan, many of the strongest Democratic candidates who could have challenged him were scared away by his high approval ratings after the end of the Gulf War. This left a group of lesser-known Democrats competing for the Democratic nomination. The eventual winner of this process would be a man named Bill Clinton, the governor of Arkansas. Bill Clinton was advised by a man named James Carville. James Carville told Bill Clinton that to win the election, he should focus on economic issues. It so happened that the United States had entered into a recession near the end of Bush's presidency. This caused people economic concern, and Bill Clinton played on that to gain votes from people, letting them know that improving the economy for them would be his first priority if he were elected president. When election night came, Bill Clinton was actually the victor of the 1992 presidential election. But it was a close race, and one in which he did not even receive 50% of the vote. The reason the winner didn't receive 50% of the vote was because there was a third candidate, a significant candidate in the race, a man named Ross Perot, who was an independent. He was a businessman from Texas who ran for president, not claiming to be a real politician, but saying that we needed to have somebody who wasn't a real politician. Ross Perot garnered 19% of the vote in this election. Bill Clinton, the winner, only received 43% of the vote, and George Bush received 37%. Nonetheless, Bill Clinton easily won the Electoral College because of where his votes were cast in the country. One has to wonder, if Ross Perot had not run as a third-party candidate, who would have actually run the election? Would it have been George Bush or would it have been Bill Clinton? We actually can't say for sure. As the President of the United States, Bill Clinton represented a new, what he described as third way in politics. When he viewed the Democrats' losses to Ronald Reagan in 1980 and 1984, Bill Clinton and other more moderate Democrats believed that the cause was that the Democratic Party had become too liberal. These more moderate Democrats had formed a group that they called the Democratic Leadership Council, which tried to advocate for more, at least moderate, if not conservative Democratic candidates and Democratic policies from the Democratic lawmakers. This was seen as a new sort of Democrat. These more moderate, even arguably conservative ones. They had come into being to compete with the Reagan Revolution that had brought the conservative point of view to power. When Bill Clinton ran for president, he selected as his vice presidential nominee a man named Al Gore, a senator from Tennessee. So you had two Southerners representing the more conservative wing of the Democratic Party who campaigned successfully to become president and vice president. In doing so, Bill Clinton once famously in a speech declared that the era of big government was over, that essentially admitted that the conservative revolution had won and future politics would be played on their turf. An example of the relative conservatism of Bill Clinton compared to other liberal Democrats can be seen in his support of Nafta, which stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is an agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, which had been negotiated while George W. Bush had been president, but had not yet been approved by the United States Congress. Bill Clinton went to battle to convince the United States Congress to approve Nafta. Now, in the past, Democratic candidates would never have done this. They would have tried to protect American workers rather than opening up the country to free trade. But this is an example of how a Democratic leader had come to embrace at least some more conservative values as president. One of the more controversial things that happened during Bill Clinton's time as president was the issue of having homosexuals serve in the military. Homosexuals had been banned from serving in the military historically. There were some very practical concerns about this. About, for example, if you have separate bedrooms and separate shower facilities and separate bathrooms for women from men. The obvious explanation for that is the potential sexual interactions between the groups that you don't want to have, particularly not in the military. Well, if you allow homosexuals in the military, then those same kind of sexual tensions could arise between people of the same sex. So what do you do to avoid that happening? Do you put every soldier in his own private apartment, his own private shower, in his own private bedroom, in his own private bathroom? This represents the kind of practical concerns that some people had about homosexuals serving in the military. Now, surely there was a level of discrimination too, but whatever the actual level of discrimination, arguments like that were made as practical reasons to bar homosexual service. Now, if the conservatives wanted to keep homosexuals out of the military, liberals wanted them in. They campaigned for the opportunity for homosexuals to join the military freely and openly. Bill Clinton therefore got pressure from both sides of the political spectrum. Liberals wanted him to end the ban on gays in the military. Conservatives wanted him to keep it. What he settled on was a middle ground, a third way as he might put it, what became known as the don't ask, don't tell policy, where nobody would be interviewed about their sexual orientation when they were joining the military. In exchange for that lack of scrutiny by the government, they would agree to never bring up their sexual orientation either. It would simply just be a secret, I guess you could say, that gays would be allowed to join the military, but while in the military, they were not allowed to come out of the closet. What this did, though, was rather than being a compromise that could make both sides happy, it ended up making neither side happy. Conservatives were now concerned that gays were in the military, and they wondered what it might do to the very logistics of maintaining a military force, what it might do to the cohesion and unity of the troops, etc. While liberals thought it didn't go far enough, that it was still a discriminatory policy against homosexuals, which needed to be done away with. This is an example of Bill Clinton trying to walk that middle path and not making either side happy. In 1994, Republicans ran in a much more unified position than were Democrats. An example of this was Newt Gingrich, who was a congressman from Georgia, a Republican congressman from Georgia, who became the leader of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. And he got them to rally around a specific agenda that they would try to implement if they were elected. This became known as their contract with America. As part of the contract of America, Newt Gingrich and his fellow Republicans promised things like a balanced budget, term limits for members of Congress, meaning that they could only be elected so many times, etc. They wanted to limit the power of government through the contract with America and return more power back to the people. This ended up being an effective argument to make, particularly in response to Bill Clinton's things like allowing gays in the military and that offended some of the more conservative people in America. Newt Gingrich and his followers were able to rally enough votes that they actually captured the United States House of Representatives for the Republican Party for the first time in about 40 years. Now faced with a Congress controlled by Republicans, Bill Clinton would have to become even more moderate or more conservative than he had before to get anything done as president. Another group that had influence over politics this time was the Christian Coalition. I've already mentioned in previous lectures how Christians, particularly evangelical Christians, had become mobilized in politics. The Christian Coalition provided a private organization through which they could cooperate and they could rally in service of political causes. It was founded by a TV evangelist, a TV minister named Pat Robertson, making use of contacts that he had created when he had briefly ran for president in 1988. The founding of the Christian Coalition allowed him to reach out to people and mobilize them in politics without having to do so through his church. A young man named Ralph Reed was hired to lead the Christian Coalition, and Ralph Reed and Pat Robertson grew its influence around the country. It's always important to note as we discuss the conservatism of this era that it was built on sort of three legs of a stool. One was those who believed in a limited role for government in their lives. Another was those who supported traditional Christian values. And the third were the anti-communists. The Republican coalition primarily united these groups together, and it was important to have active Christians working in politics to help that happen. In 1996, Bill Clinton ran for re-election. His Republican opponent now would be a man named Bob Dole. Ross Perot ran again, but this time he only got about 8% of the vote. and Bob Dole was a relatively weak candidate on behalf of the Republicans. Arguably, he only got the nomination not because of his talent, but because he was sort of the next in line. He'd ran for president before, he'd served in government a long time, it just seemed like it was his turn. But he was never a very good candidate. And Bill Clinton kind of cruised to an easy victory, which gave him a second term in office beginning after his election in 1996. In that second term in office, Bill Clinton benefited from a giant economic development. It was during these last years of the 1990s that the internet really took off. And with it taking off, various stocks related to it, they were called .com stocks, took off also. They vastly increased in value over this time period, which added a lot of wealth to the American economy and had the benefit of allowing Bill Clinton to preside over a strong economy. But eventually, this bubble that had developed as people overvalued these new internet stocks broke. But it broke around the time that Bill Clinton had left office and the younger George Bush had taken over as president. So we had the luck of the draw that the Democrats in the late 90s, particularly Bill Clinton himself, benefited from a roaring economy. But it was roaring because the value of tech stocks had been vastly overinflated as people competed to own them. When they eventually realized that the stocks were overinflated in value, the market crashed, returning us to a more normal state, but in the meantime destroying a bunch of wealth that Americans had accumulated in the stock market. But that did not happen yet. Instead, during the Clinton presidency, Bill Clinton was riding high on a strong economy. Perhaps that made him too overconfident, and he was able to indulge some of his coarser desires. Bill Clinton had a long history as a ladies' man that had supposedly cheated on his wife many times. But historically, newspaper reporters had not been too concerned about the affairs of politicians. For example, when Franklin Roosevelt was president and he had a regular mistress, the news media saw no reason to report on that. When John Kennedy was president and he had what have been speculated to be frequent affairs as president, those were not reported on by the media either. But things had changed by the time Bill Clinton became president. The media was hungry for controversy. They saw what the Watergate scandal had done for news reporting. It not only provided them something to write about, but it elevated them in the eyes of the public. In the Watergate scandal, you had the reporters of Woodward and Bernstein that had brought down a sitting president and forced him to resign from office. In the aftermath, every newspaper reporter wanted to be a Woodward or Bernstein. Watergate had that profound effect. So, what happened was committees in the House of Representatives were investigating Bill Clinton. They really believed that down underneath, he was a wild-eyed liberal that only faked being moderate and conservative to get into office, and they were determined to run him out of office somehow, some way. Well, what happened was that Bill Clinton was involved in a lawsuit. There was a woman who had worked with him while he was in Arkansas, who had claimed that she had been sexually assaulted by Bill Clinton. Now, as part of that lawsuit, Bill Clinton had to testify under oath and be recorded. While he was under oath, the lawyer for the woman who claimed that she had been assaulted by Bill Clinton asked Bill Clinton if he had ever engaged in sexual relations with anyone besides his wife since his marriage. In other words, had he ever cheated on his wife? He answered with a clear declaration that no, he never had. But what we would later find out through a string of coincidences and leaks was that Bill Clinton was actually maintaining an affair with an intern that worked in the White House, the woman in this picture named Monica Lewinsky. Well, when people eventually found out that Bill Clinton was violating his own sort of ideals that he claimed, and that he was not just having sex in the Oval Office, but he was lying about it, this gave the Republicans the ammunition they thought they needed to force him out of office. See, he had lied under oath, which is the crime of perjury, when he was interviewed about the lawsuit with the woman from Arkansas. The United States Congress treated that lying under oath as a sufficient reason to impeach Bill Clinton and remove him from office. But when they actually did impeach him, they failed to remove him from office. They could not get enough votes in the Senate to convict him. Not even close. Matter of fact, Bill Clinton actually ended up more popular by the end of this controversy. People saw it as an unnecessary attack on him over what was really a personal matter. It should have been between him and his wife Hillary Clinton, whether or not he had an affair with Monica Lewinsky. It getting dragged into the public sphere turned people off. And by the end of his presidency, Bill Clinton's popularity was above 70%. In one sense, it didn't matter that the Republicans had failed to remove Bill Clinton from office. He was actually late in his presidency, and he could not run for re-election in 2000. Instead, his vice president, Al Gore, became the nominee of the Democratic Party. Al Gore was not nearly as charismatic as Bill Clinton, and he struggled to find real traction during the campaign. But nonetheless, Bill Clinton's presidency was viewed as a generally successful presidency by the American voters, and Al Gore had that going for him as he ran for president. Nonetheless, the 2000 presidential election ended up being very close. His opponent, George Bush, the son of the first George Bush, ended up actually winning the election, just barely. Now, when I say just barely, this was one of the closest elections in American history. Al Gore actually got 500,000 more total votes in the country. But that's not how we elect a president. We elect president through the Electoral College. And George Bush won the Electoral College. He won the Electoral College because he captured the state of Florida, which was the most closely contested of all the states. Out of the millions of votes cast in Florida, George Bush, after they were initially counted, only had a lead of several hundred votes. Al Gore then demanded that the votes in Florida be recounted in case he might have actually been the winner. But that recount was a long, arduous process. There were lots of different kinds of ballots used in Florida, including some where you had to physically punch out holes in a card to register your vote. This required people to go slowly by hand through the ballots to try to count them. The process dragged on for weeks without us knowing for sure who was actually going to be the President of the United States. That was until George Bush sued over the recounts and how they were being conducted. And the lawsuit went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Now, I can't go into the details of why, but the United States Supreme Court eventually ruled that the recount was being conducted in an unconstitutional manner and needed to come to an end. This, in effect, declared George Bush the winner of the presidential election, because at the time that the recount was brought to an end, he still led in the vote totals by only about 500 votes. Well, sometime later, a group of people representing accounting firms descended on Florida, got access to all the ballots, and did a careful recount of them to try to figure out who actually won the presidential election in 2000. And they came to the conclusion that George Bush, in fact, did get the most votes in Florida and was legitimately elected president. As president, the newly elected George Bush faced a major problem, and that was that the dot-com bubble was bursting. It was coming apart just about the time that he was elected president, and the prices crashed. This harmed the economy. So he came into office not only as a president who had gotten a minority of the vote in the country, but one that was now overseeing economic difficulties. It looked like there might be difficult times ahead for him as the new president. But then something happened to completely change what people in the country were focused on. That was the War on Terror. The War on Terror began with the September 11th terrorist attack in 2001. In which 19 hijackers seized 4 commercial airline jets, flew 2 of them into the World Trade Center in New York City, which caused those buildings to collapse and killed about 3,000 people. Another one into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., where the United States military is headquartered, and a fourth plane was headed toward Washington, D.C. to crash into an unknown target, perhaps the White House, perhaps the Capitol building, when the passengers on it rebelled against the hijackers and it crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. This terrorist attack suddenly, overnight, changed what Americans were concerned about. The perpetrator of the attack, I should say the mastermind behind it, was a man named Osama Bin Laden. He was a Saudi man, a man actually related to the Saudi royal family. He was a prominent member in a terrorist network known as Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda had organized the attacks and carried them out. And in the aftermath of the attack, Osama bin Laden went into hiding to avoid retaliation from the United States. He went into hiding in Afghanistan, where he could be under the protection of the Taliban. Osama bin Laden was a very conservative Muslim, and the Taliban, the group of people that were ruling over Afghanistan at this time, were also similarly conservative, traditional sorts of Muslims. And so they were happy to protect him. This then led the United States, as they looked to retaliate against Osama bin Laden, to view not just Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda as their enemies, but also the Taliban in Afghanistan, who had given safe harbor to this terrorist mastermind. In the aftermath of the terrorist attack, President George W. Bush developed what became known as the Bush Doctrine, which guided him in his pursuit of terrorists around the world. The Bush Doctrine can be summed up as the idea of preemptive self-defense. George Bush wanted to make sure that never again would we wait until an attack happened that might kill 3,000 Americans before we go try to hunt down the perpetrator of it. Instead, he wanted to know who was planning to attack and then go kill them first. While this might be an effective way to limit American deaths, it had the problem of, by attacking people who had not yet attacked us, possibly making the United States look like the bad guy in these confrontations. The first confrontation with the terrorists of the world came with a military operation named Enduring Freedom, which was the United States invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. The purpose of the invasion was to drive the Taliban from rule of the country and to hunt down the terrorist network that was protected there, including Osama bin Laden himself. Well, none of those goals were ever entirely successfully carried out by the invasion of Afghanistan. In fact, 20 years later, the United States would withdraw from Afghanistan and the Taliban would regain power. So in some ways, the longest war in American history, that in Afghanistan, would end up being a wasted war for the American people. But arguably it did make a difference. Because while American soldiers were fighting against these terrorist elements in Afghanistan, those terrorist elements were distracted by that attack, which meant that they were unable to mobilize other attacks against American citizens elsewhere in the world. So perhaps in that sense, the Afghanistan war was a success. In addition to pursuing the war in Afghanistan to try to track down and eliminate Osama bin Laden and his supporters, the United States also became concerned about the possible necessity of war with the country of Iraq. This is the country the United States had driven from Kuwait. And in the aftermath of that, the leader of Iraq had continued to be belligerent toward the United States. To pump up his own image in the views of the world and to, he hoped, insulate himself from attack, he routinely dropped hints about that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction, such as nuclear weapons, biological weapons, and chemical weapons. And we knew that it was certainly possible that he might do such a thing, for Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons on his own people when they tried to rebel against him. So under the Bush Doctrine of preemptive self-defense, Saddam Hussein, an avowed enemy of the United States, having weapons of mass destruction, which he could potentially pass on to terrorist networks, was just the kind of thing that needed to be eliminated before it could act and kill Americans. So the United States planned an invasion of Iraq. Now, the biggest champions of the invasion of Iraq were a group of people who were ideologically known as neoconservatives. Neoconservatives were described by the academic Irving Kristol as liberals who had been mugged by reality. And this was sort of the general view of what a neoconservative was. It was a person who, at some point in their life and their political development, had been a sort of traditional liberal, a person who believed in government intervention, who believed in the New Deal, things like that. But over time, they'd come to conclude that the liberal movement had become too weak, and it had also made mistakes along the way, that the sort of socialism of the New Deal wasn't working, that in fact we were losing to communists and others abroad. And so we needed a more powerful, more aggressive foreign policy. Neoconservatives became champions of wars to create what they called regime change. This was based upon a theory that democratic countries around the world would never fight each other. So if some countries seemed to be our enemy, the best way to make them our enemy no longer would be to convert them to democracy. Well, what if they didn't want to become democratic capitalist countries like us? Well, then we'd go to war and force them to be. That was the central point of the neoconservatives. And there were many neoconservatives that were serving in government and elsewhere in important places in society that had an influence on George Bush as he decided whether or not the United States should go to war in Iraq. This then led in 2003 to the United States Congress providing George Bush with an authorization for the use of military force against Iraq to go eliminate this potential threat. He made use of this authorization of force to attack Iraq, beginning first with a giant bombardment of the country. Bombs were dropped by planes on military targets and on major cities. This is a scene of bombs falling on the capital of Baghdad. This massive bombing campaign at the beginning of the war was described as shock and awe. It was supposed to frighten the Iraqi people into not wanting to stand up against the United States troops should they invade Iraq. What's interesting about this was not a declaration of war. The government simply authorized that Bush could go to war if he wanted to. This is generally what has happened since World War II, which was the last time that the United States government officially declared war. You see, the United States Congress has the responsibility to declare war. But if they instead tell the president, you can go to war if you want, they have passed responsibility to him. If it goes bad, they can claim it's his fault instead of theirs. The way that Congress avoids a declaration of war is an example of them delegating their power to avoid responsibility. Initially, the war in Iraq was a great success. The bombing campaign weakened the military and scared people throughout the country. So when the United States troops entered, they had an easy time defeating the Iraqi army. And at that point, President George W. Bush believed that the mission had been accomplished. He flew to an aircraft carrier out in the ocean to deliver a speech about the idea that we had essentially, although not quite yet, won the Iraqi war. It turns out that this was actually far from the truth. Though we had defeated the Iraqi army, many Iraqis still remained upset about the presence of the United States in their country. This led to an improvised guerrilla war against the United States. Of particular note in this guerrilla war was the use of improvised explosive devices. The Iraqis, in many cases, would take unused United States military bombs and convert them to devices that they could hide alongside roads or underneath the pavement of roads even, and detonate when the United States vehicle was moving by carrying American soldiers. In this way, hundreds and thousands of Americans were wounded in Iraq. It showed how peace would not be easy there. The Iraqi insurgents, in fact, didn't just set off roadside bombs. In some cases, they took control of entire cities or entire provinces of the country. The United States did not have a sufficient enough force there to keep control of such a rebellious country in its entirety. But along the way, one bright spot in this occupation of Iraq was when Saddam Hussein was eventually captured. When his Iraqi army was defeated, he had gone into hiding. When he was eventually captured, he was turned over to an interim Iraqi government that had been created by the United States, molded along Western values. They held a trial, they convicted Saddam Hussein of what they called crimes against humanity, and he was hanged to the death. This is an actual scene of him being prepared to be hanged. It was something that was viewed by people all over the world when it happened. So the early time of George Bush's term in office, his first term in office, was defined by the pursuit of the war on terror, particularly the battles in Iraq and Afghanistan. But this wasn't the only place where the United States was fighting the war on terror. In fact, it was a global war on terror. This was a name actually used to describe it. George Bush, the president, had claimed that the United States would seek out any threats to the United States around the world from any terrorist group. This led them to pursuing terrorists, trying to kill terrorists in places such as Syria, Yemen, and Somalia. It was not just Iraq and Afghanistan where we went to hunt down the terrorists and kill them. Of particular interest is the country of Libya. Libya was also dominated by a dictator, in some ways very similar to Saddam Hussein, a man named Muammar Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi, in the aftermath of the American invasion of Iraq, worried that he might be next. Now, something interesting happened when the United States invaded Iraq. They were hunting for the weapons of mass destruction that they believed that Saddam Hussein had prepared to possibly turn over to terrorists to attack the United States. But when they invaded the country and looked for those weapons of mass destruction, they unfortunately could not find them anywhere. Now, there was debate at the time whether Saddam Hussein had destroyed them or moved them or what. The best explanation now is that he never had them. He had dropped hints that he had them as a way to bolster his image in the region, to make it so that other countries wouldn't dare attack his country for fear of retaliation with either biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons. But this was just big talk that he had used, and it turned out to backfire in the case of the United States because of the doctrine of preemptive war. His bragging about all the weapons he had and his hatred for the United States led to the United States to attack him, to try to get rid of him. Now, when they ended up finding that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, this ended up looking bad for the United States, as though we had attacked them for no reason, though they were not really a threat. But something else odd happened that may mitigate this result. Muammar Gaddafi, the leader of Libya, had actually been engaged in the creation of a nuclear weapons program. And he freely alerted the United States to that fact and gave up his nuclear weapons facilities for the United States to dismantle and take away. He did this to preserve his own power. So it's interesting, while we went to Iraq to get the weapons of mass destruction and failed in doing so because apparently they didn't exist, we actually did end up capturing a weapons of mass destruction program in Libya simply because the dictator of Libya had been so scared by what we had done in Iraq. George Bush then ran for re-election in 2004 as a wartime president. Some people were already becoming deeply concerned about the war, and this hurt his popularity. To try to take advantage of that concern, Democrats ran a man named John Kerry for president. John Kerry had served in Vietnam, and when he had returned from Vietnam, had become an anti-war activist. So many Democrats saw him as a champion of the anti-war movement that was building in the country. The problem was that John Kerry had actually voted yes for the authorization of force to be given to George Bush for him to decide whether to go to war with Iraq. This fact muted his anti-war criticism. In the end, George Bush won victory, but a fairly narrow victory over John Kerry. He had a second term, but he was not a particularly strong president at this point because of the various difficulties that he had had, and those were about to get even worse. During the battling in Iraq, when the United States forces would capture someone who didn't just seem to be a common soldier who they could let go and send home to their village wherever it was from, but captured somebody who they thought was more of a threat to the United States, they had to do something with these people. They had to house them somewhere to keep them under control. That somewhere was a prison in Iraq called Abu Ghraib prison. And what unfortunately happened there was the guards at Abu Ghraib prison began to treat the prisoners in very inhumane ways, even torturing them. The picture here shows a Iraqi man who has had electrodes attached to his hands from the building electrical system. The threat was that if he misbehaved, such as by saying something he wasn't supposed to or stepping down from the box he was standing on, he would be electrocuted. This kind of torture was, if not standard in Abu Ghraib, at least it happened enough that it became not just an isolated incident, but a way of life there. They took recordings and photographs of the things they did, which were eventually leaked. And when the United States and the media found out about what was going on in Abu Ghraib, it was a terribly embarrassing thing for the United States that hurt our reputation in the world. It wasn't just soldiers that were captured on the Iraqi battlefield that ended up in a prison that became controversial. Other suspects from around the world who might have been captured in the fight in Afghanistan or Iraq or some other country around the world, who were thought to be part of actual terrorist networks, were instead housed at a separate facility in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. What on earth? What are you saying, that we have a United States military base in Cuba? Yes, we do. This is the leftover from the Spanish-American War. And these terror suspects from around the world were brought there because it was a legal no man's land, a gray area. If we had actually brought these suspects back to the United States, they would have been afforded constitutional rights, such as counsel with a lawyer, a right to confront witnesses, no cruel and unusual punishment, things like that. But the United States didn't want to deal with them in a situation like that. The United States was still trying to extract information from these people that might help them track down other terrorists. As a result, Guantanamo Bay ended up developing a bad reputation too. It was a place where people were sometimes tortured for information, but most importantly, it was a place where people were, in essence, arrested by the United States government, but never given a trial. They were locked in a legal no man's land. They might be prisoners, but because they were being imprisoned in Cuba, it was argued that they didn't have the same individual rights as prisoners within the United States might have. Well, this was another black mark upon the American record. When President Obama was elected president, he claimed that the very first thing he would do when he got into office was that he would close Guantanamo Bay, but he never did. Because once he was in office, he realized that among the prison population there in Guantanamo Bay were people that we as a government just knew were bad, really bad people, the kind of people that if you let them go, they would go kill Americans. But they didn't have proof of them having committed any crimes against the United States. So if they were put in a position where they had to actually give them trials, they would probably walk free from those trials, and that couldn't happen, which is why they kept them in the no man's land of Guantanamo Bay. Another incident that weakened the presidency of George W. Bush was the landing of Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana. This hurricane devastated the city of New Orleans, flooded most of it, drove many refugees out of the city. The reason this was a bad thing for George W. Bush is because many people felt that the humanitarian crisis that took place in New Orleans in the aftermath of the hurricane could have been avoided with better planning and a more timely response after the storm hit. And they blamed these failures of the bureaucracy on the man that was on top of the bureaucracy, George W. Bush. This then therefore further weakened his position as President of the United States. Even as the difficulties were continuing with Iraq and the new difficulties with Hurricane Katrina, an additional problem that was affecting George Bush and his ability to govern America was a series of protests around the country in 2006, fighting for the opportunity of illegal aliens to get legal status and eventually work toward their way towards citizenship in the United States of America. George Bush and other conservatives didn't want this to happen. This was for two reasons. They believed that these illegal immigrant voters were basically future Democratic voters, not Republican voters. But they also felt that they didn't deserve to have the opportunity to be in America permanently because they had entered illegally. They had not obeyed all the same rules as other people had obeyed that would come into the country. Nonetheless, they had many supporters who thought that they should be given legal status and a greater freedom in the country. At the same time, there were those who didn't. This led to this string of clashing protests across the country that made things further difficult for George W. Bush as president. The most pressing difficulty he had as president, though, was how to get American troops out of the Middle East after they had, as he had originally put, accomplished their mission. This then led to the Iraqi Surge in 2007, when approximately 30,000 new troops were dumped into the country. Their goal was to get the country stable enough that the American troops could eventually withdraw. They had to put down the organized criminal attacks on U.S. troops, such as by using IED devices. This surge was effective. They were able to pacify most of the country and bring it to a sense of orderliness that would then allow eventually for the American troops to leave. The departure of American troops was negotiated in 2008, near the end of George Bush's time as president. A status of forces agreement was reached between the United States and Iraq in 2008 that allowed the American troops to withdraw and to be primarily replaced by native troops who would try to maintain order in the country and not to let the country fall prey to terrorists ever again. They were certainly more successful than what the people who were supposedly going to run the Afghanistan government against the Taliban, but failed to do so after the withdrawal of American troops in 2021. While the American withdrawal of Afghanistan turned out to be a failure, the American withdrawal from Iraq was much more of a success. It allowed the Iraqi government to take care of its own security needs, and they have remained in power since. The country has not fallen into the hands of any sort of terrorist supporters thus far. At the end of the presidency of George W. Bush, the United States faced one of its greatest economic crises in American history. This became known as the Great Recession. The root of the Great Recession was a collapse in the mortgage marketplace. When we talk about mortgage marketplace, we're talking about the collection of loans that Americans have taken out to buy homes. What happened in the lead up to the Great Recession was that many Americans bought homes, were even encouraged by federal law to buy homes, who they weren't really capable of buying. People bought homes that they simply couldn't afford. But what happened was this bubble of people buying homes that they couldn't afford had greater consequences throughout the economy. The reason for this was because banks invested in such things. When you deposit money in a bank, the bank doesn't just hold on to your money. It tries to make money off of your money, such as by loaning it to other people. But another way that banks can make money is by investing it in various things. In this case, such as buying home loans. So you take out a loan from some certain bank and then they end up selling it to another bank. Well, that's a good deal for that other bank if you're going to continue to make payments on your loan. But what if you don't? Well, what happened was these home loan failures that took place in mass in 2008, where the value of the mortgages on homes had outstripped their actual value, led to a sequence of failures throughout the economy, including taking down two big traditional investment banks, Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns. The ripple effects of these collapses in the economy would have gone on to perhaps crash the entire economy of the planet if governments had not stepped in to stop it. They stepped in by providing massive bailouts to other banks and other economic entities that had overextended themselves before the crash. This led to political difficulties in the years that followed. On the political right, a group formed that became known as the Tea Party. This was a reference to the Boston Tea Party in the early history of the United States of America, where the Boston Tea Party people had engaged in this protest against what they viewed as governmental excesses of their time. In this case, the governmental excesses that members of the modern Tea Party movement were referring to was the government bailouts of these companies that had overextended themselves prior to the Great Recession. The idea was that government should live within its means, and that the government was wasting money bailing out these irresponsible companies. I shouldn't say wasting the government's money, wasting the people's money doing it. They wanted government reined in from distributing too much money to bad people. Well, the tactics that have been used to essentially rescue the country from the Great Recession were also criticized by people on the political left, such as the Occupy Wall Street movement. They weren't so concerned about the amount of money that was used to bail the country out of the Great Recession. They were concerned about who the money went to, that it went to Wall Street bankers and their companies, rather than to the common people who were losing their homes during the housing bubble collapse. This is where sayings about the one percenters who needed to be, who had too much wealth came from. So the actions taken by the government to overcome the Great Recession created enemies against these government policies on both the political right, in the form of the Tea Party, and on the political left, in the form of the Occupy Wall Street movement. During this time when the Wall Street banks were being bailed out, the President of the United States was Barack Obama. The housing crisis had actually begun while George Bush had been president. The failures had happened and the beginning of the bailout happened while he was president. But the continuing repercussions took place after Obama became president. Both presidents contributed to these policies that alienated people on both the extreme left and the extreme right. Barack Obama had become president by getting elected in 2008 as the first African American president in the United States history. He had defeated a Republican named John McCain, who was too attached to the failures of George Bush's second term in office and was penalized by the Great Recession that took place with a Republican in the White House. Barack Obama, though, had his own problems. He was a very inexperienced politician that many people saw as not ready for the presidency. But they voted for him nonetheless because America didn't want to be seen as racist anymore. And voting for a black candidate was an opportunity to prove to the world that we were no longer racist. So his black skin, unlike in generations past, rather than being a detriment to his candidacy, actually ended up being a great support to his candidacy. As president, his greatest legislative triumph was the passage of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. This is a law that created a national health insurance system that with the goal of ensuring that every American would be insured. It was commonly known as Obamacare, and its passage was a deeply controversial thing. It seemed to the Tea Party movement to just be one more example of excessive government spending. This energized them to come out in full opposition to Barack Obama and the Democrats during the 2010 congressional elections. This allowed the Republicans to sweep into power And from that point forward, though Obama would eventually be reelected, he was in some sense an ineffective president, what we sometimes call a lame duck president, because he would never again have a majority in both the House and the Senate of Democrats that would allow him to move any sorts of controversial policies forward. He really couldn't get much done for the rest of his presidency. But he didn't need congressional support to continue the hunt for Osama bin Laden. The military was doing this regardless of who was president, and they eventually located him in 2011 and staged a strike in which American commandos entered a building in Pakistan and shot Osama bin Laden dead. This was something of a triumph for Barack Obama, even though he was not directly responsible for doing it. He could at least claim that this enemy of America had finally been brought to justice while he was president. But much of the presidency of Barack Obama was a time of stagnation. The government was divided, with a Democratic president and a Republican Congress that couldn't agree on anything. The economy was just limping along after the Great Recession, not going back into recession, but not really growing either. It was in the midst of these sort of just stagnant things that Barack Obama was then running for re-election. While he won his re-election, it was a close race against the Republican nominee, a man named Mitt Romney, a former governor of Massachusetts. Barack Obama sort of easily won the election in the Electoral College, even though the popular vote was fairly close. Because what he had done is he won all of what we call the swing states, the states that could really go either way for a presidential candidate. Barack Obama won them all. Even after 4 years of controversy and stagnation, Americans were still willing to give Barack Obama the benefit of the doubt as he ran for re-election. A big issue in elections that occurred during the Obama presidency came out of challenges to the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, which had actually been passed into law well before Barack Obama became president. The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, which was named as bipartisan because its two sponsors were John McCain, a Republican, and Russ Feingold, a Democrat, tried to get rid of what they called soft money. This was the expenditure of third parties that couldn't really be tracked by the reporting system for the spending of campaign money. This law banned third parties, among other things, from running commercials in the weeks leading up to an election. Well, this feature of the law ended up being challenged as unconstitutional. What happened was, in 2010, a group named Citizens United tried to create a movie about Hillary Clinton, who they knew would be running for president one day. It was a negative movie about her, and they wanted to prevent her from becoming president. When they tried to advertise for this movie, they were prohibited from doing so because of the rules in the bipartisan campaign finance law. Well, the group sued, and their case went all the way to the Supreme Court. In the case of Citizens United, that was the group that tried to make the Hillary movie, versus the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission. The United States Supreme Court ended up ruling in the favor of Citizens United. In their ruling, they essentially ruled that corporations had the same sort of rights as people because they were collective groups of people. This included the right to free speech. And a necessary thing for having free speech in the United States of America is the opportunity to spend money to actually promote the things that you want to say so you can be heard. So the United States Supreme Court ruled that free speech would allow any group to spend any money it wanted supporting a candidate before an election. This was a big victory for the group that wanted to run the movie against Hillary Clinton. It was a defeat for those who wanted to keep money out of politics. Another big issue that came to prominence during this time when Barack Obama was president of the United States was the concerns over global warming. Global warming is a short-term reference to the idea that humans are changing the climate of planet Earth through their production of greenhouse gases, particularly through the burning of fossil fuels. This notion of global warming has been around for a while, for many years, but what has given it particular legitimacy since the time of President Obama was a United Nations organization called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an organization of scientists from all over the world who would meet annually to discuss the latest scientific evidence about climate change and issue recommendations about how the countries of the world might deal with it. This gave an air of legitimacy and authority to accusations about global warming. This is where we get notions about there being a scientific consensus about global warming being a real threat to humanity. But the IPCC are not the only ones that popularized this idea of global warming being a threat. Another person who did is Al Gore, the former presidential candidate, the man who lost to George Bush in Florida in 2000. He created a new career for himself as a global warming warrior. He made a movie in 2006 called An Inconvenient Truth, in which he tried to convince people the danger of global warming. That movie is full of exaggerations and half-truths, but Al Gore justified this as a necessary measure to get people as concerned about global warming as they should be. This sort of propaganda has become effective, as global warming is one of the most important issues for the younger generation of Americans in America today. But not everybody was on board with these sorts of changes. Much like in the 1980s, when there was sort of a backlash to the excesses of the 1960s and the 1970s, hearkening for an earlier, better time, which led to the election of Ronald Reagan as president. In the mid-2010s, there were some people who were also desperate for an earlier, more conservative time, a time when they felt America had been a great nation to live in, but was fast changing because of progressive changes in politics, such as the election of Barack Obama, the spending on the bailouts during the Great Recession, the Affordable Care Act putting government in charge of the healthcare system, etc. They yearned to go back to a day before those sorts of government excesses. And they found a champion in Donald Trump and his slogan that he wanted to make America great again. The idea is that America had lost its way. We'd become weak in the eyes of the world. We had lost our connection to our traditional values that made us strong. And he would become a champion of these things if he was elected. Well, in the 2016 presidential election, he succeeded in a stunning upset, defeating Hillary Clinton for president. Hillary Clinton was viewed by many people as the heir apparent to become president of the United States when Barack Obama left office. Donald Trump was a businessman who came into politics late and was viewed as kind of a joke to begin with, and then as a long shot. He ended up winning the presidency by, in a sense, reversing what Barack Obama had done in 2012. Barack Obama had captured all the swing states, and that had given him a comfortable victory over Mitt Romney. In 2016, it was Donald Trump that captured the swing states, particularly those in the Midwest, places in the Rust Belt, where they felt their best times had passed them by, and Donald Trump was claiming he would restore them. This gave him a victory over Hillary Clinton in the Electoral College, even though he, like Al Gore in 2000, had lost the popular vote. Because he got elected without the popular vote and just the Electoral College, Donald Trump was not accepted by many Americans as being their president. They still thought that Hillary should have won, and they tried to find some excuse for why she had not. What they settled on was a false story that was originally created by the Hillary Clinton campaign, that Russia had interfered with the election to support Donald Trump becoming president. This Russian collusion idea was a total hoax. but nonetheless enough people believed it that an official government investigation was undertaken, led by a man named Robert Mueller, a former FBI director. At the end of that investigation, they concluded that there was no evidence that Donald Trump had colluded with the Russians to win the election. And then in the years since, we've come to find out that the original sources of these rumors were just simply making stuff up. And they did they did much of the making up at the behest of the Hillary Clinton campaign. This was sort of an insurance policy that Hillary Clinton's campaign had tried to create to ensure that she would win the election by tying Trump's victory, if it did happen, to the Russians. But it turned out it was a complete fabrication that the country wasted about 2 years of time and energy on. As president, Donald Trump tried to follow through on a campaign promise that he had made to seal our borders and remove those who were in our country illegally. The most controversial part of this effort was his attempt to deport so-called dreamers. These were people who had been brought to the United States as children, perhaps even as infants, who had then grown up in the United States as just Americans in their mind, even though they were not legally present in the United States. The attempt to deport them, along with others, turned out to be very controversial, and it remains controversial till the time of this recording. We now move to the last section of the last chapter of this online textbook, a section titled New Horizons, discussing about the last stages of recent history and what it might mean for the future. The generational group that is now coming to power in America are known as the Millennials. These are people who were born around the turn of the millennium, from the year 1980 through 1994. These were young children and then and young adults at the time that we transitioned to the 2000s. They're now in their 30s and 40s. These are the people that are coming in power, and they are different than previous generations of Americans before them. One of the ways they're different, as you can see in this picture, is they are more comfortable with technology being a constant part of their lives. They are also generally politically more liberal than previous generations of Americans. They are less religious, and they have more economic insecurity. They're not quite sure of how they're going to make it through old age, and this may lead to them wanting greater government intervention to help them out when the time comes. In the meantime, they've already had an effect on various social issues. A good example of this is same-sex marriage. Just a couple of decades ago, a majority of Americans were opposed to homosexuality. It was generally thought that it was an inappropriate activity that should not be out in public and certainly should not be endorsed by the government. Within a short time, though, we ended up with same-sex marriage being declared a constitutional right by the Supreme Court in the case of Obergefell versus Hodges. And this was completely all right with the millennial generation, who view such things in a much more positive light than the generations that came before them. Another way that millennials are different than the generations that came before them, as I said when I showed you the first picture of them, is their comfort with technology. This is because they grew up with personal computers and, more importantly, smartphones, computers that they essentially could carry around in their pockets. They can't imagine life before you would carry an extension of your brain essentially in your pocket in the form of a smartphone, containing all its apps and information that could make your life easier, but not always make your life easier. Sometimes these apps make your life more complicated. An example of this is social media. Social media is both a blessing and a hindrance. Social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter allowed us to be more interconnected as people, but they're also more distracting and in some cases more destructive toward people's perceptions of themselves. But they are a fact of life now that millennials and generations that are coming after them are growing up with as just part of the normal way that the world works. This then makes them part of what is known as viral media. Somebody may come up with some interesting thing on the other side of the planet. They post it to the internet, such as on YouTube. People see it and they pass it around from one person to another. And in a short time, millions of people all over the globe have seen it. This allows us to be interconnected with people all over the planet. But social media and things like YouTube also allow us to become unconnected. We can form our own little tiny communities of like-minded people. People that we maybe have never even met, but we share our views of the world with. And they become our family support, sort of, even though we're spread out apart from each other in cyberspace. These new kinds of media have fed into social movements. A couple of examples with which we will conclude this chapter are the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. The Me Too movement, which really got going in 2017, was a movement essentially driven by social interactions all over the internet, which then led to public demonstrations in support of women who had been victims of sexual assault. The Me Too movement put forth the idea that women should be believed, that when they stand up and claim that they've been assaulted, that they are one of many, that's where the Me Too comes from, many, many women who have faced similar problems, and that they should unite together to defend and support each other. Part of this was this assertion that women that make these accusations should be believed. But there's a controversial side of this too. Just because a woman asserts that she was sexually assaulted, that does not prove that she was. And just believing her means that in some cases, false accusations can be taken as truth. So the Me Too movement continues to exist. It continues to be a driving force in the women's movement, but it's one that in some ways remains controversial. And for some people, there's a belief that it's gone too far. Some similar things can be said about the Black Lives Matter movement. It began in 2013, but really got going during the time of the global COVID pandemic and some cases of police brutality toward Black Americans that happened during that time. This led to giant street demonstrations in which the slogan Black Lives Matter was chanted. Now, this was meant as an affirmation of the importance of the lives of Black people, that they were not disposable, that we should make a big deal about when they came to an end at the hand of government officials. But again, while that may not seem like a controversial thing to say, the way it was being said was controversial nonetheless. Does championing Black Lives Matter mean that you aren't considering the lives of other people? What if someone says in response, all lives matter? Does that mean that they're devaluing Black lives? Does the concentration just need to be on Black lives because of what they've gone through? I'm not going to tell you how to answer that question, but it's an ongoing question as the Black Lives Matter movement continues. And that brings us to an end of this chapter and brings us to an end of this textbook. I hope you enjoyed this course, and I wish you well.